move to the next item, which is private members' business motion on social housing. Call on Deputy O'Brien.
Thank you, Lasky and Corla, and I move the motion. Minister, as you know, last year more than 16,000 eviction notices were issued by landlords to tenants in the private rental sector, and more than half of those eviction notices were on grounds of sale. Sale of property is the single largest driver of homelessness for families, for couples, for singles, and indeed for pensioners. And as a consequence of that, in the last year alone, the number of people in emergency accommodation funded by your department has increased by a significant 13%. We have never had as many adults and children, single people, couples, families and pensioners in emergency accommodation since these records began. In April 2023, under pressure from the opposition and frontline homeless service providers, the Tenant in Situ scheme was properly reopened, and local authorities in particular were given the flexibility they needed to ensure they would buy homes to prevent families and singles becoming homelessness. And while we don't have the final figures for last year, Minister, somewhere in the region of 2,500 households have been prevented from the trauma of homelessness because of that scheme. Minister, this scheme is working. It is working really, really well, and the parliamentary questions that you signed off on today with respect to this scheme from deputies from all parties, government and opposition, show you that. But unfortunately, the scheme has always had its opponents, both in government and indeed in the civil service. There are some people who think that the state should not be using any of its capital funding for acquisitions. I've heard people suggest that somehow local authorities are taking the easy option buying these homes when other options are available for people at risk from homelessness. And while there is no evidence to support any of that, there are two very significant problems right now, and you know what both of these are, Minister. Failure of government last year to set the capital ceilings and targets for this year means the scheme is paused, and there are hundreds of applications pending a decision across the state. But more worryingly, the memo that was sent by your department to local authorities a number of weeks ago is setting out a series of new and significant restrictions to this scheme. And if adequate funding is not provided alongside new restrictions, then people, real people, families, children, pensioners, who would have otherwise got access to this scheme if the rules remained the same, will be denied access to it this year and are at greater risk of homelessness. Now, Minister, I appreciate you're new in the job. I appreciate you have a huge learning curve to meet, and that you're listening to many different views on this. But I'm really urging you not just to listen to your officials, but talk to the frontline homeless service providers in our local authorities and read carefully the letters I understand you have been sent by some of our leading homeless charities, because they are telling you, if you do not provide the same level of funding at a minimum this year as last, specifically for Tenant in Situ, then local authorities will run out of funding before the year's end. And if you allow the specific restrictions that we've listed in our private members' motion to make its way into the circular which you will sign, less homes will be bought and more people will be at risk of homelessness. Minister, this is really one of the first big decisions you're going to have to make as Minister, and I think it's going to say a lot about the trajectory of travel of your tenure over the time ahead. There are occasions where we will have political rows across the chamber, but this is actually one where we're telling you a decision of government 2 years ago was the right one, the scheme is working, and we're urging you, as our frontline homeless service providers in our local authorities and our homeless charities, not to make the wrong decision. Now, here's the thing, Minister. If you make the wrong decision, and if people who would have otherwise been prevented from going into homelessness otherwise end up in emergency accommodation because of your decision, then that is on you. Everything else we talk about at this point is the responsibility of your predecessors. You and you alone ultimately will make the decision. And I'm really urging you, despite the fact that the wording of your counter-motion is deeply disappointed, take some time to reflect before you sign off on that circular. Listen to the people at the front line who we trust to tackle the issue of homelessness. Listen to your own backbenchers who know this scheme is working, and ensure, hopefully as a matter of urgency, when you make the final decision on capital allocations and when you sign off on that final circular, our local authorities will have the money and the flexibility to ensure that no household, family, single or couple without children will be forced into homelessness because of a bad decision of you and your colleagues. You can do the right thing here, Minister, but it's not what's in your counter motion, and I'd urge you to reconsider.
Deputy McGuinness.
The last Ceann Corlia. Minister, currently in Waterford, 17 applications under the Tenant in Situ scheme have been suspended. And that's 17 families grappling with huge uncertainty and anxiety, not knowing if they will have a roof over their heads this year. And that situation and that sorry story is replicated all across the state in the hundreds. The moves by government to reduce funding and restrict the Tenant in Situ scheme will lead to children, women and men becoming homeless right across the state. Over 15,280 people are availing of state-provided emergency accommodation at the moment, 13% increase on last year. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, as you know, when it comes to the real homeless figures. The government seems to be hell-bent on sending still more of our people into homelessness by restricting this scheme. Every week in Dungarvan and in my clinics around County Waterford, I meet families and individuals that have been served with a notice to quit. And the only solace they have, indeed the only thing between them and homelessness, has been the Tenant in Situ scheme. When Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil shamelessly lifted the no-fault eviction ban in 2023, the story spun was that the Tenant in Situ scheme would ensure no one became homeless as a result. And while the scheme on its own could never hope to mitigate against the abject failure of the government's housing policy, remember homelessness increased by 15% in 2023, it did offer protection to many vulnerable families facing evictions through no fault of their own. We know the scheme can work when it's allowed to. Arguably, it's one of the few schemes instituted by the government that has actually worked. Yet it has been paused for months and will be restricted and potentially wound down altogether. Minister, will you change course from this disastrous approach, fully fund the Tenant in Situ scheme for 2025 and give local authorities the resources and the maximum flexibility to operate it?
Our homeless accommodation in Galway City and Galway County is completely and utterly full. That means that there are 2 councils at least that cannot provide accommodation in case of an emergency. At the same time, Minister, if you're looking to get a HAP property in Galway City or Galway County, it is near on impossible to find one. So if you get an eviction notice in Galway City or Galway County, what is the option available to you? You can hope that you can get Tenant in Situ scheme, and that is something that has worked in Galway City and has worked in Galway County. But now there are huge amounts of people in limbo. And Minister, I actually was contacted by a woman tonight who wrote to me about her specific case, and I want to read it out to you because it'll just show the pressure that she is under. Maria Cara, I am contacting you directly as I am under huge pressure to ascertain where the application under the Tenant in Situ scheme stands for the purchase of the property I'm renting. My landlord has made an application to sell the property under the Tenant in Situ scheme for some time and is being frustrated at the lack of progress and has decided to put the house up for sale on the open market. My notice of termination expired in early January and I am fearful that the house will be sold in the very near future. I understand that there was an issue with the Council receiving its budget allocation for 2025, but I hope that this has been resolved at this stage. If the house is not purchased under this scheme, it will be an incredible pity, as the house would be a very good investment, especially in such a rural area. On a personal level, this is absolutely devastating for myself and my young son as we are facing homelessness. Minister, there is nowhere for people to go in Galway City. There is nowhere for people to go in Galway County because there is not the emergency accommodation. There is not the rental properties. In this very rural area, part of Connemara, there is literally nowhere to go. There are concerns in relation to the memo that was sent out in terms of the amount of funding that would be there and also the particular restrictions. I just really urge you to consider all of this, consider what this woman is saying when you make your decision.
Minister, I don't expect this government to tell the truth in relation to anything related to housing, given the Taoiseach's repeated refusal to confirm or deny that Minister Jack Chambers deliberately misled the Irish people during the general election. But here are some truths. Since April 2023, 2,500 households have been prevented from becoming homeless because of the scheme. 16,546 notices of termination were issued to private residential tenants last year. more than half of those on the grounds of landlords intending to sell the property. The number of people in the Department of Housing funded emergency homeless accommodation increased by 13% in the last year to 15,286, including over 4,500 children. And I was shocked late last year when I started to get emails and messages from people in relation to the length of time it was taken, or the fact that the local authorities weren't approving any new tenant in situ applications. This left people absolutely puzzled, and I got onto the Housing Department in Fingal, and they confirmed, yes, we can't proceed with any more because the government haven't given us the figures, and it left hundreds of people, families and individuals, without a decision due to a lack of funding. This is a result of the government's failure to give the targets and its funding that is putting greater numbers of people at risk of homelessness, and landlords are getting frustrated. People who want to sell their homes to the local authority, they want to sell them, and they are disengaging from the scheme. So let's make it simple. You need to ensure that local authorities have the maximum level of funding and targets to be able to operate the social housing tenant in situ scheme. You need to provide the local authorities with flexibility to operate the scheme and reject the new restrictions that are being proposed by the Department of Housing.
Minister, I wish you well in your new role. The tenant in situ scheme has been hugely successful in preventing hundreds of families in Cork from becoming homeless. This scheme has allowed Cork County Council to buy up properties for tenants who face a no-fault eviction notice, allowing the family to remain in the property as council tenants. This scheme is working, and it should be expanded to ensure the maximum number of tenants at risk of eviction and homelessness can avail of it. But instead of increasing this vital protection for renters with eviction notices, the Minister for Housing has reduced funding and cut targets for this scheme. He has also imposed a series of new restrictions on the operation of the scheme. For example, under the new rules, single people and couples without children will be excluded. This in itself is deeply, deeply concerning. This new rule not only disregards the realities many face in our society, but also maintains unfairness in a system that should be about providing housing stability for all who need it, regardless of their circumstances. Single people and couples without children are just as vulnerable to housing instability as families with children. Now, with the exclusion of these groups, the Minister for Housing is telling many people that they are less deserving of having a stable home simply because they do not fit the certain family model. This is not only an unfair distinction, but a deeply discriminating one. In the short time I have, it has been covered on Red FM and all local papers the last number of days. Jonathan is 33, lives in a caravan in Cove. Stayed in his sister's place, had to move to a car park. Council are pushing him on again. He works 2 jobs. He can't get on the housing list because he doesn't have an address. He was told to use his sister's address. That means her rent goes up. So the system here is very, very unfair. I want to put that on the record because I think there's many, many other people like this. But I will finish with saying that housing should be a right, not a privilege. Determined by the size of your family, the restrictions of a tenant in situ scheme need to be reversed to ensure that everyone, single or couple, parent or not, has access to a secure, stable home.
Minister, for the last decade, with the exception of COVID measures, the number of people accessing emergency accommodation has been rising. Today, there are 46 properties to rent in the entirety of my constituency, which is 2 counties, County Longford and County Westmeath. A very basic 2-bedroom property is now well over €1,000 a month, and an actual shed is €270 per week. Your own department's homeless reports show that from January 24 to January 25 in Westmeath, there has been a 17% increase in adults accessing emergency accommodation. In Longford, the figure has remained static. Cold comfort to the couple yesterday who were refused B&B vouchers for themselves and their 4-month-old baby, with literally no idea where they were to spend the night. The emerging trend, Minister, of parents with young children seeking emergency accommodation being threatened with referrals to Tusla is nothing more than repugnant. These parents are incredibly aware of the difficult position they are in. They are literally living it. Yet the tenant in situ scheme, which has prevented some 2,500 households from becoming homeless, has been in turmoil, and there are hundreds of applications left in limbo. Any efforts to restrict this scheme will put greater numbers of people at risk of homelessness and disincentivise landlords to engage. Sinn Féin fully supports the Tenant in Situ scheme. Our alternative housing plan proposed funding 2,000 acquisitions in 2025 and 6,500 in total over 5 years. We want the scheme to continue. We want the scheme to continue at the current rules, with no new restrictions, the same levels of funding, because you have an obligation, Minister, in your new role to protect those vulnerable families that are so desperately in need of long-term, secure homes.
Minister, the housing and homeless crisis has been getting worse under successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments. So this decision to further restrict the Tenant in Situ scheme, a scheme which has prevented so many people from becoming homeless, is absolutely bizarre. On top of these new restrictions, we also have delays on applications going back months because your government couldn't get its act together and agree new funding levels and targets for 2025. And what these delays mean, and I'm going to give you an example. A mother in my own constituency with 2 children who has been living in a home for 10 years has been waiting since last August to find out if they are going to have to leave their home. The home that their children has only known. Now, this woman's landlord was happy to go down the Tenant in Situ route, but because of the delays in funding for her application with Fingal Council, it's been put on pause now for 6 months, leaving this family in limbo. Minister, this isn't good enough. And now you're restricting who can apply. Single people and couples without children won't be able to avail of it. And it also appears that these changes will mean that local authorities will not be able to refurbish homes that they buy under this scheme. To me, Minister, this reads like an attempt to do away with the scheme itself by making it totally unworkable. But Minister, this scheme has proven to work. In the last 2 years, it has prevented 2,500 households from becoming homeless. Now, we in Sinn Féin have put forward a proposal of funding of the scheme that will allow for 6,500 homes to be purchased in a 5-year term. We want to continue to work under the current rules, and we want to make sure that local authorities have the staff to process the applications. Last Count Carla, I would ask all TDs in this House to vote for this motion. This motion also calls to give local authorities the funding and the flexibility to help this scheme. This scheme, Minister, will prevent other families going into homelessness. Please, please support this motion.
Thank you, Deputy Quinlivan.
Minister, the announcement made by yourself on the Tenant in Situ scheme will make more people in Limerick homeless. That's a fact. That's what you're doing. The changes announced by yourself are a mistake and they should be brought back as a matter of urgency. The scheme, as this stood, was working. It stopped thousands from becoming homeless. It should have been expanded. It should have been further funded. It is one of the simplest ways to deliver homes for working people. Instead, the Minister has reduced funding and cut the scheme's targets. The restrictive and punitive new rules exclude those who have no children and also exclude single people. Perhaps most ridiculously, councils that have no money for refurbishing their properties cannot now reclaim refurbishment costs from your department. The limited funding combined with additional restrictions makes increasing homelessness, as I said, in Limerick inevitable. Limerick Council held a webinar with councillors last week about the impact of these changes and regarding the current state of play of the housing support in Limerick, and the situation, as you can imagine, is very, very bleak. Across Limerick, there are 107 acquisitions on hold from last year, and with a capital funding allocation for second-hand acquisitions at around €6 million, we understand it is estimated only 20 to 22 of these will proceed with. What that means is there is no capacity to purchase any future properties where notice to quits orders have been issued. What that means is there are 85 households we know of whose inhabitants will become homeless. This excludes any notice to quits from this year. On top of this, there is no refurbishment costs assigned to acquisitions of any properties purchased in a condition short of turnkey ready cannot be prepared for those in need of housing. When the government was formed, there was a lot of rhetoric about getting to grips with the housing crisis, and it looks like you're falling at the very, very first hurdle. After five years of failing to meet targets of ever-increasing homelessness of a general election where the actual targets were hidden and public deceived, one might have hoped a new minister might start with a new approach, an approach that keeps people out of homelessness. At last, this is a case of here we go again. Here we go again with more homelessness. Here we go again with sky-high rents and house costs rising. Here we go again with restrictions imposed on those most desperate for housing and those who cannot afford to purchase their own home. I think the Minister would be best served to take note of the opposition on these charges. He should increase the capital allocation for 2025, not reduce it compared to 2024, allow refurbishment costs and the arbitrary 2-year housing support rule, stop excluding single people and couples or children from the scheme. The Minister says he is committed to ending homelessness, yet takes actions that will only serve to increase this already high numbers of people who are without a home.
Thanks, Minister O'Sullivan.
Gurma, good Laskin Corla. I'll be taking the opening statement on behalf of the Minister, and just want to say, look, first of all, I very much welcome this motion. Over the last number of weeks, we have heard called. What's that?
Amendment.
Yeah, we'll be moving we'll be posing this and moving the amendment. Yeah, I'll be doing that later in the body of the speech, Laskin Corla. But just very much welcome the motion in that over the last few weeks we have heard calls from opposition and government backbenchers to continue the Tenant in Situ scheme to ensure that's in place, to provide clarity on it, and that's exactly what we're doing today, and that we are continuing the Tenant in Situ scheme. And we're doing it because of the reasons that you have been outlining. Over 2,000 people, families, households have avoided homelessness because of the scheme. So we very much welcome that, and it has been a success. And that's why we are continuing it. But you know, we are continuing with guardrails. We are giving still significant amounts of money to local authorities to acquire homes for those who are at risk of homelessness. But there has to be some type of guardrails in place. And I've heard it referred to as restrictions, and I've heard on many occasions that single people will be excluded. That is not the case. We are giving flexibility, but there will be prioritisation criteria. And when you're dealing with the figures and the sums of money that we're talking about, which are necessary to ensure that people avoid homelessness, there is a degree of having to have those type of guardrails in place to ensure that it's done properly. But I suppose the upshot, and I think something that has been sought by both government and opposition, is clarity on this. And the clarity is that the Tenant in Situ scheme will be continuing. As I said, I welcome the opportunity to speak here today to oppose the motion on behalf of government and to outline to you the progress made to date with second-hand social housing acquisitions, and specifically Tenant in Situ acquisitions, and make clear that the concerns raised are in fact already being addressed. The clear focus of government is to increase the supply of new-build social and affordable homes. Increasing the overall housing supply is key to addressing the housing challenge, and in particular preventing and ultimately eliminating long-term homelessness. Notwithstanding, government has and will continue to support a targeted second-hand social housing acquisition programme which responds to the needs of the most vulnerable. Government has therefore increased the 2025 budget for the second-hand social housing acquisitions programme from 60 million available over Housing for All to 325 million, and is giving local authorities the flexibility required within the programme to respond to needs locally. Tenant in Situ acquisitions are recognised as a key measure in preventing homelessness. It positively benefits vulnerable tenants that receive a notice of termination from their landlord, and as such, I want to reassert the government's commitment to the continuation of more focused and targeted programme to ensure it benefits those who are most in need. Under Housing for All, there is provision for 200 social housing acquisitions per annum to 2030. In light of the challenges in addressing homelessness and the reported uplift in the number of landlords exiting the private rental market and HAP and RA schemes, Government introduced Tenant in Situ acquisitions in 2023 as a temporary short-term measure to address the issue. This was continued in 2024 and has now been extended into 2025. Since the introduction of the Tenant in Situ programme in March 2023, more than 3,100 second-hand homes have been purchased, with approximately 2,000 of those being Tenant in Situ acquisitions. It is worth noting that Residential Tenancies Board received 16,546 notices of termination in 2024. This was down 13% on 2023. 9,170 of these were issued as a result of landlord intent to sell the property, and this was down 20.7% on 2023. The continuation of tenant in situ acquisitions in 2025 is a clear indication of government's commitment to preventing homelessness for HAP RAS tenants who have been served a no-fault notice of termination. To ensure the most vulnerable cohorts are protected, eligibility criteria are being introduced. These criteria will ensure that priority categories of need, such as tenant in situ, older persons, people with disabilities and people exiting homeless, can benefit in a fair and equitable manner from the programme. These criteria include priority for those most at risk, such as families with children, people with disabilities and older or vulnerable person. It is important to note that the addition of these criteria does not exclude any tenant from the scheme, but rather they provide focus for those most in need. Additionally, local authorities are being provided with increased flexibility to respond to local needs and priorities throughout the allocation of capital funding. This allocation will enable local authorities to assess all available options and to decide on the most appropriate actions in each case. As such, local authorities can identify suitable acquisitions in line with the local circumstances. Since Minister Brown obtained approval for government for additional funding this month, officials in my department have engaged with the local authorities to ensure these measures are communicated quickly and clearly to staff and local authorities. This will be following very shortly with a circular outlining funding allocations for 2025. In calculating the funding allocations and to ensure each local authority is adequately supported, metrics such as spend and delivery in previous years, the summary of social housing assessments and the number of spatial distributions of HAP and RAS tenancies have been taken into account. Minister Brown has asked that funding is used optimally to support the maximum number of affected tenants. Minister Brown has also requested that local authorities be proactive in acquiring properties for priority categories, I should say, already mentioned, and buy and renew acquisitions which tackle vacancy. To build on the progress to date, a full review of tenant in situ acquisitions will be undertaken in 2025. This review will assess the effectiveness of the programme and put forward recommendations on how second-hand acquisitions programme can, notwithstanding the emphasis on additional supply through new build, become a permanent and targeted policy response for those most in need for whom there are no other options. The targeting of tenant in situ acquisitions in 2025 will provide increased clarity and equity for the programme, ensuring those who are most at risk are protected. Refurbishment funding will not be available under the tenant-hand acquisitions programme for tenant in situ acquisitions. Such properties are the beneficiaries of significant exchequer-funded rent supports every week. They are legally required to meet the provisions of the Housing Regulations 2019 Act and are subject to inspection by local authorities to ensure they meet the said standards. Immediate essential repairs should not therefore be required. Some refurbishment works may be required in the short term to medium term, but these should be noted as part of the condition survey and programmed for future planned maintenance works, such as the capital funding available for tenant in situ acquisitions is dedicated to maximising the number of acquisitions. Funding for works which are not immediately required would prevent the number of acquisitions being maximised. There are a number of funding programmes available for local authorities to improve their social housing stock, including the planned maintenance programme, the disabled persons grant, the regeneration programme and efficiency retrofit programme. Refurbishment funding is available for acquisitions under exits from homelessness, older and disabled persons, and the buy and renew, where works are required to ensure the property meets the provisions of the Housing Regulations 2019 Act or adaptation requirement to accommodate the tenant. So in conclusion, this government is dedicated to addressing the housing crisis and is committed to the continuation of the second-hand social housing acquisition programme for priority needs, and in particular tenant in situ acquisitions, which can be an important measure in preventing homelessness. This commitment has been demonstrated by the provision of increased funding and improved arrangements for 2025. In opposing this motion, government highlights the success of the programme to date. Almost 7,000 second-hand homes have been acquired since 2020. In the period 2023 to Q3 2024, over 3,100 second-hand acquisitions have been completed, of which 2,000 have been through the tenant in situ scheme. Government is committed to continuing with a targeted second-hand acquisitions programme which will prioritise the most vulnerable households within the priority areas being supported, but which will not act to exclude persons or households. In implementing the programme, local authorities are being asked and are being given flexibility to respond to the local needs, and single persons and couples can be supported.
You're moving the amendment. Minister, you just again move the amendment, please. Thank you. So now Deputy Gould.
Minister, I would say go back and read the Act, I'd say, because I don't think you have any understanding of what you're looking to do and what we're looking to do. What we're looking to do is protect one of the few things that Minister O'Brien did when he was in office, when he actually listened to the opposition, all the opposition, when we put forward the Tenant in Situ scheme as a way of preventing homelessness. And just to give you an idea, and as a Cork man now, you should understand this, there were 1,874 families and individuals given notices to quit in 2024. Cork City Council purchased 79 homes under the Tenant in Situ scheme, and that prevented 79 families going into becoming homeless and going into emergency accommodation. And something else you might understand as a Cork man. Right now, a couple can get €877.50 on HAP. Do you know how many places are on daft.ie today where you can rent a property in Cork for that amount of money? Do you know how many? None. None is the answer to that question. And you're coming in here talking about making changes to the one thing, one of the few things that she actually got to work. Do you realise the cruelty that you're bringing to people now? You're going to drive families and drive people into homelessness and into emergency accommodation. Look, Cork City Council actually overachieved. There's Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael TDs come in here criticising local authorities. We have a local authority who's doing it right, who's actually beating the targets, getting more people in. And what are you going to do? You're going to cap them and you're going to limit them. And just this decision to roll back on this, it's a disgrace. And I'd say to Minister Brown, your first job in will be to increase homelessness. You brought in a scheme a number of years ago, banning evictions, right? And the question I have to ask about the banning evictions and about getting rid of the Tenant in Situ scheme, who got to the ministers, who got to the government?
Deputy Kenny.
First of all, Minister, to wish you well in your post and to commend my colleagues for bringing forward this motion. The Tenant in Situ scheme is, as many have said here, worked very, very well for an awful lot of people out there who are under serious pressure. However, since probably, I suppose, last summer, we've seen a decline and a grind to a halt. And I have many, many people in my constituency. I have a young woman with 4 children. She's a nurse, but because her children are small, she can't go to work. Her husband works locally in the fire brigade in her local town. They are in a rented house. They have a notice to quit. It's valid. They're going to have to leave that house. They can find nowhere else to go. And the Tenant in Situ scheme is the only option they've got. And up until now, they have been told that it is not open, that there is nothing there for them. And you're saying, and I respect, you're talking about that you're going to have the circular coming out. The question is, why has that circular taken so long to come? Where has it been up to now? Where is the sense of urgency in delivering for people? Why have local authorities not clear? You're saying you're going to bring clarity. What has taken so long about this clarity? Why? Why delay? Why can't we have it now? Why can't people know where they stand? Why can't the local authorities know how much money they're going to have so that they can go out there and purchase the houses to take people out of their misery? Because it is hugely stressful. And I have dozens of people across my constituency, and I'm in a rural area which doesn't have the same housing pressures as a lot of our urban areas have. But I have dozens and dozens of people in this situation where they have notice to quit, where the local authority is prepared to buy the house, but they do not have clarity from you, Minister, to try and deliver this. So what we need to do now is you need to support the motion we've got, and I take it you've put an amendment to it, which usually means the government in some backhanded way is going to oppose it and going to go off and do their own thing anyway. And what you've done up to now has been a failure. And don't continue with that failure. You're a new minister in a new position. Start where you mean to go on. Show that you are about something different, that you're going to actually deliver for the people out there who need delivery, because too many people are in too much stress and this government is letting them down.
Thank you. Caherlock. The number of adults accessing emergency accommodation across the North East region of Louth, Cavan and Monaghan during a single week in January of this year was 263, a nearly 1/3 increase on the same period as last year, and the number of children was 130, near a 70% increase on the year-on-year. So what can you do? The Tenant in Situ scheme is one mechanism that provides a vital protections to ordinary renters from facing into the cruel, unyielding reality of a local rental market that simply does not have the stock to adequately meet demand, let alone do so at a reasonable price. By facilitating local authorities purchasing homes, not only does it provide a security of tenure for that renter, while also increasing the rental stock in general, but it also prevents that person from joining the growing list of those accessing already overstretched emergency accommodation services. The proof of this scheme is that it has prevented more than 2,500 people from entering homelessness since April 2023. The new Minister, you will face a significant test in the coming days. Will you adequately fund this scheme for the 2025 without reducing undue restrictions? Or will you underutilise or even allow this crucial renters' protection against homelessness to effectively wither away? I would like to commend my party colleague and Sinn Féin spokesperson on housing, Deputy Owen O'Brien, for bringing forward this motion tonight and mandating the government to ensure that local councils have the maximum funding available to operate this scheme, and to reject undue restrictions which will serve only to exclude those who could benefit from this vital support. In particular, as the housing crisis worsens year on year due to failed government policy, I would appeal to every deputy in this chamber to absolutely reject proposals that would see the deprioritisation of single people and couples without children from accessing this scheme. I would therefore again appeal to every deputy, and I appeal to you, Minister, to endorse this policy or this motion. Thank you.
Dr. Crowe.
Good, Margaret. It doesn't make any sense, but the government seems to take every opportunity it can to make the housing crisis even worse. Like we've heard here tonight, you know, the amount of people that, that saved 2,500 households from being made homeless. Families with children, couples, single people, including pensioners, have been presented from long stays in emergency as councils were able to buy their private homes. So we know the scheme works. So the question is, why, Minister, why have you not signed off on the scheme? And why are councils waiting for an answer from your department? I was dealing with a case today, and a family are going to be told tomorrow that the landlord is gone out to the open market and he's already got a valuer in. The house has gone up 30 grand since it went into this scheme, and the landlord will say he's given all the information. The local authority will say that they have all the information, but they haven't been able to sign off on the scheme. So there's problems there with the scheme, but it's a lifeline for ordinary families. And what we're asking, Minister, is that you throw out that lifeline, you give certainty to the market and resolve this issue that's outstanding.
Margaret, takeim Michel as scéim seo scéim tíocht a hóisiilta de Tenanta an láthair mar go scéim é a bhí agus mas go córáid leanúnt atá ag Dáil le siúd tá an liste tíocht hóisiilta hana féin agus atá faoi bhagart gombeadh siad gan déan amach an seo. Níl annach pí amháin don le céimne ar gá chun Dáil leis an géir chéim tíochta agus ligann siad a clanna seasamhacht a bheith có ina saoil seachas bat agus bóthir bheith tugadóibh. A lándáibh siúd atá ag glórach takeíocht don lehéil is céim bíonn siad insnathe ar fa tréimh le cuiseach fada agus bíonn siad ceangad leis an cantar bhfuil siad i géirí fannacht. Others have spoken about the need to address this in terms of making sure that there's less homelessness, but there's also a need for quicker decision. And there's a need in particular, and I listened to the Minister and what he was speaking about the lack of refurbishment funding in this. That's absolutely ridiculous given the situation a lot of these families find them in. A lot of these homes were not visited by local authorities because over the years the HAP or the ROS wasn't adequately addressed, yet you're expecting them to stay in those accommodations. I have one case of a 29-year-old with 2 autistic children who's paying privately for therapy because once again the state had failed her. But 7 years into a HAP payment, no assessment was ever done on her property. Yes, that's bad, but it's even going to be worse if you put those 2 children into homeless accommodation for God knows how long, given the state of the homeless list in this city. So this is one of the schemes that can work. This is a landlord who's willing to engage, but he has been forced to look at the private market because the delays in you making the announcement on this scheme and the delays in local authorities addressing the problems, and also the fact that local authorities said they won't move because there's adaptations like attic conversions, and yet you're talking about allowing sheds and back gardens, and you're not allowing people to live in the home that they've been in for 7 years.
Party an lucht ibre agus cúigé gomaide tomaide tosach de teachta síhan.
Mágad cahirirlach agus bála mo buchas dús bora gháil leis an Party Sinn Féin as ocht an rún seo thuirt faoi bhrád an Dáil agus mullen Party an lucht ibre an rún seo. The government's announcement in relation to tenant in situ leaves more questions than there are answers to. This is a vital scheme to stop even more people ending up in homelessness, and the cynical move to put a de facto end to this scheme by restricting it so much to make it effectively unworkable is an absolute disgrace, and it's not fooling anybody. And the fact of the matter is that people who are facing no-fault evictions are simply not high on the priority list of this government, and that's a fact. And this has effectively been confirmed in the circular issued to local authorities, and I quote, "The purchase price and associated fees, e.g. valuation, legal, etc., will only be recouped to local authorities, AHBs, and must be within acquisition cost guidelines." And this means that no refurbishment costs can be claimed on the scheme, only legal and valuation schemes. And this excludes large swathes of people in the private rented market who live in poor quality housing due to no fault of their own. And we know that AHBs and homeless organisations have written to them in this, and they've said very clearly that access to funding for refurbishments was a barrier, in fact, to the success of this scheme. And this scheme was a successful scheme, a reasonably successful scheme, and one of the few wins that the previous government had when they lifted the no-fault eviction ban. It's now the 3rd week in March. We are effectively 1/4 of the way through the year, and local authorities still do not have a unit allocation for tenant in situ. The scheme has effectively been in purgatory since the general election, and I know in my own local authority that my own council had over 100 applications literally left in purgatory at the end of last year, and they reckon, and they've told me, that under this revised scheme they'll be lucky if they are able to complete 20 this year. And I want to focus my contribution in particular to the changes in the scheme. I don't understand for the life of me why you are now excluding single people and what they have effectively done to deserve this, because we know single people are the biggest group on the social housing list that aren't really moving, and we know we have a chronic shortage of one-bedroom units, and this will make the situation even worse. And I don't understand either why the sins of the landlord are being put on the head of the tenant by making landlords who are not registered with the RTB ineligible for this scheme, because the fact of the matter is tenants in the private rented market are some of the most precarious people in housing in this country, and many of them are terrified of their landlords. They're terrified of getting a notice to quit, and the fact that they could make their landlord register with the RTB is farcical. And to be honest, there is nothing really to be gained by any landlord from selling their property to the local authority as opposed to putting it on the private market due to the shortage of housing and how much house prices have risen in the last couple of years. And I can't understand why you are making it even harder for them to do what is right, to do what is there for the common good by making this scheme even harder to access. Instead of discouraging tenant in situ, we should be encouraging it by offering landlords even some form of tax relief to sell their properties tenant in situ to the council. And since these changes, I've been inundated with contact from several concerned approved housing bodies and housing initiatives ever since the changes were announced, and they tell me, and I'm quoting, that the tenant in situ scheme has proved very effective in preventing homelessness amongst hundreds of households since its introduction. It's been a safety net for people who have been issued a no-fault eviction notice by their landlord, and has successfully prevented homelessness, keeping families in their homes and adding social housing stocks to local authorities and approved housing bodies. And I know Novus in my own city of Limerick has been very active in procuring properties in collaboration with local authorities through this scheme, and it's really anxious to continue to prevent homelessness in this manner. And they are concerned that the newly proposed restrictions will severely limit the impact of the scheme, forcing more households into homelessness for protracted periods of time with few exit pathways. And we know now that more families than ever are living in commercial hotels and hubs for far longer than the recommended 6-month period. This type of provision is extremely expensive on the state and can have detrimental impacts on the physical, social and emotional well-being of family members. And under the tenure of your predecessor, Minister Darragh O'Brien, he said, and targets were considered minimum attainment for each local authority, so that if opportunities arose to prevent homelessness through the scheme, local authorities and approved housing bodies could do so. And now you have effectively blown a massive gaping hole in that. We urge you to reconsider these restrictions on tenant in situ, which we believe will have unintended adverse consequences for vulnerable households throughout the country, increasing homelessness at a time when the system is creaking at the seams. Rather than imposing restrictions, this scheme should be extended, and it would be easier with all of us if the government were honest with people, instead of trying to spin this as that it would still protect the most vulnerable. That is simply untrue. It's very clear that the Department of Public Expenditure don't like this scheme. It's expensive, and that the Department of Housing have been told to take a scissors to it. And it would be better for all of us if government were honest about that. And in the time available to me, I want to tell the House about one of the many people I am dealing with who do not know what they are going to do or where they are going to go after their NTQ expires. I'm dealing at the moment with a woman called Kira, who's given me permission to tell her story, who was initially told by her landlord that the landlord wanted to sell the home she was living in January 2024. She was going through the tenant in situ process for almost the entirety of last year. However, the application was closed out on the 18th of December because there was no allocation for 2025. We now know that the allocation that's coming for 2025 will not even cover the necessary refurbishment work that needs to be done in the home that she has lived in for over a decade. This home is now going on the open market. Herself and her partner have been on the housing list for a decade now. She has said to me, we are now coming up to our last 3 months in a home that our 7-year-old son only knows as his home, and we have begged the council to buy it. And we are desperate and we are willing to try anything. And Minister, I don't know what to tell her and others like her that I am dealing with at the moment. I don't know what answers or what hope they have. The fact of the matter is there's no advantage to landlords to sell to the local authorities. We're all honest here. You'll get much more if you put a home on the private market. And it's almost like the government thinks that landlords are trying to sell to the state in order to cash in. That's simply untrue. The changes have turned this scheme from being a safety net to stop people going into homelessness to effectively a scheme of last resort. And government policy has now changed in that it actively wants and favours vacant possession and sale on the open market. And this is a distinct policy shift, a shift away from preventing homelessness, and it's absolutely shameful at a time when homelessness has never been so high, and private rents have never been so high, and people have never been in such a precarious situation to come along and to do this now. The fact of the matter is this scheme should have been extended and expanded as it was. Instead, it's been completely filleted. It is unworkable. Local authorities are lucky if they're going to be able to do a fraction of the small amount of tenant in situs that they completed last year. And to come in here and to claim that you're protecting vulnerable people in the private rented market, it's fundamentally dishonest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to continue on from where my colleague Deputy Sheehan left off, what the government intend to do if they implement all the recommendations from the Department of Housing is turn, albeit an imperfect scheme, but a scheme that was keeping people out of homelessness, to turn it into a zombie scheme, a scheme that exists in name but is not practical and will not help people stay out of homelessness. It's disgraceful, the plans that are afoot in terms of the tenant in situ scheme. The tenant in situ scheme, as it has existed in the last number of years, is I suppose, a function of a dysfunctional market. It's not a scheme that would exist if we had a housing system that functioned. We don't. So unfortunately, we needed a tenant in situ scheme. We needed it to keep people out of homelessness, to keep families out of homelessness, to keep single people out of homelessness, to keep couples without children out of homelessness. Unfortunately, this government, if they continue on with what the department recommends, they will ensure that many more people enter homelessness. Again, the most recent person to come to my clinic last weekend was a single woman, divorced, in her early 60s, recently on invalidity pension, just had to give up work, whose tenant in situ application had been rejected by the council due to the lack of funding. That woman is going to end up in homeless accommodation with a disability when we actually had a landlord who was willing to sell to the council, who actually had a good relationship with their tenant, wanted their tenant to stay in their home, but the landlord was unable to pursue that because of this government's disgraceful decision to stop funding in December and now to present this filleted zombie scheme, which is an absolute disgrace. One thing as well the tenant in situ scheme did give, even at its most basic, when an application failed, even the few months that it took the application to be processed allowed more time for maybe the local authority's allocation or homelessness department to find suitable alternative accommodation. Not always, but sometimes just even the landlord engaging with the scheme, the local authority engaging with the scheme will give those extra couple of months. Now, that's gone. All the ever-decreasing number of levers that are there for people like ourselves, for people's and citizens' information, for tenants themselves to stay out of homelessness are being removed one by this government. This government that is failing to meet their housing targets, that is failing to deliver the number of houses across any number of bedrooms, 1, 2, 3, 4 or above, disabled-friendly accommodation, all the rest. They are missing every single target. And this one imperfect scheme, which managed to keep a few people in their homes and managed to extend people's time from actually entering homelessness and give local authorities more time is now being removed. It's a callous decision by this government. I commend Sinn Féin for bringing this motion forward this evening, because an awful lot of people, the vast majority of people out there, don't know what the Tenants in Situ scheme is, because it's a niche scheme. You won't know about it until you actually are faced with the worst possible vista, that is a descent into homelessness. So it's very welcome that it's brought tonight. It deserves every airing, every bit of attention that it gets, because again, this is a really callous move by this government. What they should be doing is what the motion says, is ensuring that local authorities have certainty, have funding, are able to apply maximum discretion. We've good local authority housing officers who will, when they have some stock, when they have some timelines, that they will be able to maybe buy a 2-bedroom which have a family in it that maybe have a 3-bedroom need, just to keep them in that, so that they can ultimately transfer to a 3-bed and then move someone into a 2-bed. This is what housing officers can do if they're given the resources to do it. This government, like the last government, which is the same government, are removing these levers and these possibilities to keep people in their homes, removing them one by one. It's callous and it should be reversed. Thank you.
Anish na Dáil hi sosialta agus Chuck the Heron ní Bomaja.
Real Margaret Cahirlock. I want to thank Sinn Féin for bringing forward this motion. Very timely, vital, and it is deeply disappointing to see the government not support it and implement it and put forward amendments which really take away the point of the motion. I am deeply, deeply annoyed and frustrated by this government's failure to act on homelessness and to treat it like an emergency. A home is one of the most fundamental needs that people have, yet clearly you are not understanding the true value of a home. You wouldn't be bringing a wrecking ball to the Tenants in Situ scheme that was working to prevent people losing their home. You wouldn't be sabotaging one of the few policies that are actually doing something to alleviate homelessness if you understood that value of a home. Shamefully, you're pulling the small rug that was available to tenants out from under their feet. When the eviction ban was lifted in March 2023, a measure that was actually preventing homelessness as well, I described it as one of the cruelest decisions ever taken by an Irish government. And it was. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael made the decision knowing that it would result in people being made homeless. Now you are making another decision that you know will make people homeless. Where is the evidence that backs up restricting the Tenant in Situ scheme? You haven't provided it, just as you didn't provide evidence to back up the lifting of the eviction ban. It's another policy made by government, not based on evidence, but based on a lack of care and a lack of interest in dealing with homelessness and a lack of concern for some of our most vulnerable people in this society. I can't get my head around it. I said shame on Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael then. I'll say shame on you today again. It's a bloody disgrace that the eviction ban was lifted, and it's a bloody disgrace that you're now bringing a wrecking ball to the Tenants in Situ scheme. When the eviction ban was lifted, the government said that the Tenants in Situ scheme was the protection, the safety net that was in place to prevent renters being made homeless. Yet now you're rolling back and removing that promise and commitment to renters. This is an emergency. It is a social disaster. Yet this government continues to fail to treat the housing crisis like the emergency it is. It is one more example, the wrecking ball that you're doing to Tenants in Situ. 30,000 households were evicted since the eviction ban was lifted just in March 2023. That is an emergency. 14,000 in the last 3 quarters of 2023 and 16,000 last year. They are famine-scale evictions. 85% of them were no-fault evictions. The tenant did nothing wrong. 61% were where the landlord stated they were selling up the property. It shows that in most of these cases, evictions could be prevented through a ban on no-fault evictions, which you and your government consistently refuse to implement. But you claim to care about the devastation being caused by the housing crisis. The Taoiseach again said it today that he's as concerned as anybody in this House about the housing crisis. Well, I beg to differ. You seem more concerned about the Cuckoo Fund landlords who are lobbying to prevent tenant protections than the actual tenants being evicted. Since the lifting of the eviction ban in March 2023, homelessness has increased by 28%. You clearly do not see record levels of homelessness as an emergency. 3,472 children were homeless in March 2023. Today, there's 4,603 children homeless, a 33% increase. Thousands of children have gone through the trauma of losing their home since the lifting of that eviction ban. The uprooting from their neighbourhoods, from their friends, bringing a few belongings with them into a strange place, into emergency accommodation, and each child will be damaged by every day they spend in emergency accommodation. Homelessness is a trauma, but it's completely preventable. But you clearly don't see this as the emergency that it is. There are many areas that do not even have emergency accommodation. There are waiting lists for emergency accommodation. The Simon communities have recently said the government still lacks a comprehensive plan to tackle homelessness. And one of the key areas is the Tenants in Situ scheme. There are over 55,000 households in receipt of the housing assistance payment. The Simon community's quarterly locked out of the market report from December showed that just 46 properties were available to rent within the discretionary rate of the HAP scheme. Where are those 55,000 households to go to find somewhere to rent when they're issued a notice to quit? Where are they going to find somewhere to rent? The Tenant in Situ scheme offered some level of hope. It prevented a small number, though not an insignificant number, of families and individuals from becoming homeless. So the question I want you, Minister, to answer is, where are the HAP tenants to go if they're evicted? The changes to the Tenant in Situ scheme immediately plunges 60,000 households into immediate risk of homelessness. But then your government clearly doesn't care. Dublin City councillors have written to council management asking them what are they going to do to support and implement this Tenant in Situ scheme as continued. The Department of Housing and your government has introduced huge uncertainty to the scheme. We know that there are Tenant in Situ applications that are not being processed. There are people going to be made homeless as a result of the changes to the scheme. In my own constituency in Ballymun and Finglas, there are 243 people went for one social home. If there are no homes becoming available, tenants facing eviction from the private rental scheme, private rental system, and eligible for social housing, where are they going to go? This is really not acceptable, and I think that the government has to accept that they need to properly implement the Tenant in Situ scheme. Where should these people go? I also want to ask about the cost rental Tenant in Situ scheme, where those who don't qualify for social housing but qualify for cost rental actually could be prevented from eviction. Is the government going to continue funding for that? Will you continue to support, even though again small numbers, but there should be more, are you going to continue to support the cost rental Tenant in Situ scheme? What is it with you and your government's disdain for renters? You appear to be captured by the big landlords. I believe the issue is you don't care. You don't actually care about those tenants being evicted. You don't care about the individuals and families being made homeless because, as I said earlier, the evidence is there that the Tenants in Situ scheme is working. So why are you introducing any level of uncertainty into it? Tell the local authorities, use the scheme as they need it. For any household, individual or family that faces eviction, use the Tenant in Situ scheme. There is no lack of money. We have billions in budget surplus. Here is a policy that has been proven to work. It can actually work. I would argue and plead with you, reverse your limitations and new limitations on the tenants in situ scheme, keep it working, keep the funding going into it, because again it comes back to the argument, if you don't, it does show once more that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael don't actually care about renters and those being made homeless.
Dr. Cummins.
Agad Cahirlach Bwalham Wegas Agaul Sinn Féin as on Tirishkin Shaw. So I'm asking the government to engage with the opposition with housing, because frankly the policies that you're putting forward are ensuring that people go into homelessness, and that's families, children, hard-working individuals, and they're facing homelessness, and there's absolutely no reason for it. This scheme is a solution, and it's so frustrating that we're at this situation that we have to argue over this. So that scheme was set up to help to prevent homelessness. It's meant to give councils the ability to buy homes where landlords are selling, keeping tenants in place instead of putting them out in the street. It sounds like common sense, but it's not actually working that way for the government at the moment. Multiple families and individuals have contacted me in Dublin South Central about their landlords wanting to sell their homes to the council through the scheme, and the landlords, they're willing and wanting to do it. It keeps the people who are living in those homes in their community, and I cannot stress how important that is to people. It's not just a house, it's not just an apartment, it's a home. It's where their community, where they live in their home, where their children go to school, where they might go to work, where they socialise, whatever it is, their sporting facilities. So it's a total upheaval for people who are being made homeless for no reason other than this scheme isn't sorted. So there's just a pile of bureaucracy, delays and excuses. The process, even when it was working, was so slow, so tied up in red tape. And then, as well as that, then sales are falling through because landlords are just saying, oh, here, this is taking too long. You know, so people are being forced out of their homes. So I suppose I actually spoke to a woman today who said to me that her landlord was willing to sell the home to the council, and it took over a year, and several times the landlord was like, I just can't wait. Now, thankfully she did, and that person is now in a tenant in situ home, is absolutely delighted, can stay in her community. I suppose I mean, they're not just statistics of people who are becoming homeless. They're people like their mothers who don't know where they're going to have their children sleeping. They're, you know, people who are living alone, individuals who are living alone in a home, and then all of a sudden they're going to be living alone, homeless. The system just doesn't move fast enough. The homelessness numbers are at records high. The crisis is only getting worse. And there's a tool to help, which is this scheme, but it's just being wasted. Local authorities need to be given the resources and the direction urgently. I note that in your motion that you've put forward, the amended motion, that you're saying several times that a circular will be issued for 2025. Sure, it's the 19th March now. I don't know what part of 2025 that'll go in for. So we need to ensure that those places, those people who are desperately in need, that's fast-tracked, no more delays. And I'm really urging you to please work with the opposition on this. Every time somebody stands up from government side, they said they want to have solutions and that they want opposition to give things that will work. We're giving one, we're asking for you. Please do it.
Dr. Farley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues in Sinn Féin, for bringing this together. I've been listening to the conversation and the debate, and who's making this decision? Who's sitting down at a table and saying, do you know what, let's take the diamond in the rough of terrible housing policy. Who's taking this piece and saying, do you know what, let's scrap it. It's too successful nearly. It is being scrapped. It is being scrapped. As it stands, it's absolutely, if that makes you sleep at night, that's fine. But you are making this so restrictive now that it guarantees homelessness. It guarantees it. We'll see the evidence play out. How is there an evidence-based approach to say, do you know what, tenant in situ, no. You can still call it something, you can call it what you like. You speak to council officials, you speak to people who are on the receiving end, and they are very, very concerned. Because what is eligible now will not be eligible under this new scheme, creating homelessness. Families who were safe, secure. I should be standing here applauding the last government for the introduction of this policy. It was working, Minister. Is it because it's too expensive? Is it because it's too successful? I'm sincerely trying to find why would we come together and say, let's change this piece of the policy, because it doesn't make any fathomable sense whatsoever. Any property that is now being considered. As a councillor, I was around in the last term when a few people were so thrilled to have successfully gone through this scheme. But a council can't take a property without any sort of refurbishment costs. It's nonsensical. Because the government, rightly so, and the local authority will have standards. And so for this scheme to not allow recoupable costs with any sort of refurbishment works will in and of itself restrict a significant portion of units being considered for this. A house must be used for 2 years as a social house in order for it to be eligible? Where's the sense in that? Why would we not follow the people as opposed to the property? Who's making these decisions, Minister? Because it genuinely makes no sense whatsoever.
Anish on grúpa technical neamhspleách agus partíthe agus Chapter Conley.
Gur mí magad chuig nómad chuig nómad agus chuig nómad gur mí magad agus mó bhuichas tí sin féin a sucht an rún seo choras córna Dála agus an deise bheith agan bheith páirteach sa díospóireach seo. Cuir sibh an scéim seo ar fionraí, agus tá bréag á insint agah maidir leis an scéal. Cuir mé mar sinné, tá muid dír na mréag a ríis ó híh cadtáid tarlú an seo. Tá litúr agam a chur an núldam go ruirt an Ryan go raibh an scéim seo cara ar fionraí raibh an nolog. Dardaí mé cosú le gatseachta Dála eile é an seo a ríis agus a ríis. Dardaí mé é mar cheist ar sonraí úndómh, dardaí mé mar hapicil, dardaí mé ar urlár na Dála. Agus ní rang mé an éon solíireachta áil, agus bhí an Taoiseach ag caint a scáthíomh a bhéal maidir leis an scéal seo ag rá nach rá sé cara ar fionraí agus go méid scéim nua i gceist. I have, thank you to Fine Sinn Féin for bringing this. It's interesting, I had a slip of the tongue in relation to Fine Gael because quite a number of your backbenchers raised questions in relation to this issue over and over, including the former Ceann Comhairle. Such was the uncertainty in relation to this. The City Council in Galway was informed that this scheme was suspended. I raised it in every manner I could. Promised legislation as a topical issue, questions with other TDs, and there was absolutely no clarity given to me in relation to it. I was told it wasn't suspended, yet the City Council told me that there were 16 units in the middle of a contract that there was no certainty about whether that was going to be lost. 11 of those had sitting tenants. I have a letter here, as every other TD has, telling me that the council is not answering them, the landlord, in relation to the wish to sell the house under the tenant in situ scheme. No reply from the council. Another letter here similarly. But let me look then at the task force in Galway that's sitting now since 2018, because the situation is so crucial down there, and such is the emergency. And you know what the new chairperson told us of that back in November, and we have no minutes since then. You get no feeling that there's urgency here, except in the words of the chairperson, who said we must massively scale up our delivery of social housing. It's acknowledged by both local authorities that the targets haven't been met, and it's acknowledged an acknowledgement targets are not being achieved. And then when it comes to the tenant situ scheme, page 3 of the minutes, regarding the tenant in situ, Mr. from the department advised was introduced, as you've outlined, in 23 as a temporary measure, and so on, and then it was renewed. It says the department has consistently indicated this limit to the local authorities, but this figure has been exceeded, and this scheme should be a scheme of last resort. Now, I share concerns in relation to the scheme and value for money, but I place the blame firmly on your shoulders for not monitoring this scheme, for not having the figures at your fingertips as to whether it is value for money. And at the moment, it's a necessary scheme. Like all the schemes you've brought in, they've become necessary, but they're all pieces without an overall picture. And so what you've done here is brought in a scheme, the officials in the council got the work ready, and then you just cut it, and then you told us you didn't cut it, and you played games, silly games in relation to absolutely silly games in relation to where the truth lay. And across every party, they have raised questions in relation to this. How did that happen, ministers, if that's not accurate? How was it not clear guidelines given in relation to this, or news of a proper review being carried out by whom within what length of time? In the meantime, your new restrictions are appalling. And what's going to happen is our homeless services are at full capacity in Galway City. Full capacity. There are no properties available under the HAP scheme. The Simon report tells us that every quarter of every year for a number of years now, when they look at even under the discretionary schemes. So homeless at capacity, no properties available under HAP, and you're doing this with a scheme. It's simply Toshe Dokredja, agus ni féidir glacu leis, agus a rís ma bhuicasta sin féin a sucht an deis a chóirtún a leid soléirú a áil. Ach mas féidir a rá lumsa na tithe a bhí I mwail ó híh an scéim a bheith fionraí. An bhfuil na tithe sin inis I seileamh na cóirla I ngáile. Tá sé ordaí go minnig agam agus ba bhhaitlim soléirú. Garmag.
The proposed changes, Minister, to the scheme are hugely concerning. The proposed changes, I believe, will cause havoc. This is a scheme that was broadly welcomed across the House here. It's a scheme that has seemed to be working, does need to be improved. Of course, everything can be improved, and I would have no objections to that. However, the proposed restrictions that you're going to put on it could render this redundant and it's going to increase the risk of homelessness. There are no vacant spaces in homeless services in most counties, including the one that I live in, for the simple reason is that the number of people that are losing their tenancies and finishing up in homeless accommodation. Putting in place restrictions such as that property has to be registered with the RTB, you know as a constituency TD that there's a lot of rented property out there that isn't registered, and the tenant has no power to change that. That's the reality. Exclusion of reasonable refurbishment costs. This doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. The facts is that any local authority official will tell you, and you know this as well, that homes in the private rented sector, they don't receive that regular maintenance. There will be shortcomings there. No home will come in without it needing, very few will come in without needing 10, 20 or 30,000 on it. And, you know, they say people who have a disability are supposed to be okay in this, but there won't be, Minister, because there will be doors have to be widened, there will be baths have to be taken out and a shower put in. And if there's no flexibility there for the local authority to do that, that will not help their case. The 2-year rule, in other words, that the house has to be within the social housing net for 2 years and the tenant getting a rent subsidy, housing assistance payments or rental assistance payments, that is going to cause problems because a lot of them won't be in it 2 years. So you're making it very, very restrictive. It's going to, you know, it's going to cause problems and it's going to limit the number. I want to just say this to you as well, that in County Laois it has been used in 2023, it has been used in 2024. In 2025 there are a number of homes there that are in the process of buying. But it's all on hold. It's on hold because there's uncertainty now in relation to what's going to happen. And the owners of the property, they will not wait indefinitely. And that's just a fact of life. And I'm not exaggerating anything here. What I'm saying to you here is that there are practicalities. The people who drew up this, I'm not too sure who did. I'd like to know. But they have no idea what's going on out there in the real world. And I don't mean that in any condescending way. I'm just saying it doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. So we want to keep this scheme working. We want to keep this working. By all means, come forward with improvements to it, value for money, or whatever else. You know, I think reasonable people will support reasonable measures. And just, you know, it feeds into it shows the shortage of supply of social and affordable housing to buy. And I just want to mention to you for a minute in relation to the mass production of homes. You know, it's one thing that's never talked about here in this House. I took this up with previous ministers, with four of your predecessors and with Secretary General of the Department a number of times. And the main parties in this House don't seem to focus on it. But, you know, we need somewhere between 6 and 10 house types to meet the different types of needs for different sizes of families, disabled people, elderly people, etc., single people. So you know, we need to use the same plans across the state. And here's the reasons why. Having to bring in an architect and start with a blank canvas on every housing scheme is costing a fortune. It's costing 10 to 15% extra of the cost. It also delays the time and slows things down. And then those designs are sent back and forward to the Customs House, between the Customs House and the local authority, technical staff, and this can go on for a period of time. So you're cutting out all of that. How the houses were built, and I'm not arguing for 1930s or 1970 type houses, but how we increased housing supply in the 1930s and the 1970s and in other years when the state was a lot poorer, we mass produced. You know, do you really think that people in Niche care if they're living in a house that looks like one that people are living in Limerick, in an affordable house to buy or a social house? I certainly wouldn't anyway. And that's how we done it. Anybody who ever produced something at scale done so by mass production. And I'm asking you to talk to the senior officials about this and to change it. We need to be able to copy and paste plans. We need to be able to use those same plans, you know, reduce the cost. This is an unnecessary cost in terms of the bill for the houses. Speed up delivery. Let's use the same plans across the state to fit the different house types. And I'd ask you to seriously, I'm saying that to you, important. I think it's a very important issue. I'd ask you to take it on board. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ciara. Well, I am actually asking you to do what was done in the 1970s, and I'm certainly not going to apologise, because we need social housing built on a massive, massive scale. There is no other solution to ending this housing crisis. Now, I was in this Dáil over 10 years ago, and housing was the huge, huge issue. God, it seems to be so inconsequential to the government now, it's actually unbelievable in comparison. And I thought it was bad then. I just can't get over how, like, the Taoiseach actually said that housing hadn't been a central issue in the election campaign. That was his excuse for actually, you know, for your government basically telling lies to the population about the housing figures. How could housing not have? It was the biggest issue in the election, bar none. And what I never can get over is I represent a constituency that there's a Fianna Fáil rep and there's a Fine Gael rep. So we represent the same constituency. But yet all the housing problems seem to come my way, or the way of, say, Sinn Féin. They obviously don't go to your party, because otherwise you would care, because we are snowed under with the misery of the housing crisis. So just in Dublin West, for example, Hansfield Educate Together, my own daughter used to attend that school, has put an ad up on Facebook asking parents, can you please, have you any rooms? We cannot get teachers for the school. A children's class wrote to me from one of the schools in Dublin 15, probably I assume wrote to all the TDs, saying about the teacher crisis as well, due to the housing crisis. In one school campus in Dublin 15, the summer before last, 4 teachers left because their leases were up. They were evicted, right? So the one thing, the only one thing, the shining light that we had to go to anyone who was facing eviction because of sale of property, you're proposing to render it null and void. So just to say the tenant in situ scheme for eviction for sale of property, it was the only lifeline that we could point people to. It is problematic because, number one, you have to get the landlord to agree to it. You have to get the local authority to agree to it. What are TDs and councillors meant to say to people now who are facing eviction? I'm just wondering what your answer is on that. There were shortcomings in the scheme. For example, there were 16,531 evictions since late 2023 for sale of property, but yet there was only 2,500 people helped through this scheme. So there should be a lot more. The other problem is we're intervening into the housing market, which is a costly process. You are actually buying houses or paying for houses at market rate. So this is not the best way to resolve the housing crisis. It's not a substitute for building public housing, but it at least was some way of saving people from being turfed out onto the street. I want to ask you this, Minister. How many local authorities have you met with since you got your job to find out what land they have available, what capacity they have to build social and affordable housing? Just really would be interested to hear the answer on that, because We already had the Land Development Agency saying that there's a potential supply for up to 67,000 houses, but that doesn't include loads of local authority land. So in Fingal County Council, which I was on for a few months between the local elections and the general election, I put down a motion in the Greater Blanchardstown area, and there's one site there called and I'd love if you actually follow this up, Scribbletown, Elm Green, where the council have said that they could supply 7,000 homes on that piece of land. 7,000 houses, affordable and social houses. That would actually would end the waiting list in Dublin 15. You should be sitting down with councils, finding out what they're going to do to develop those land banks and reporting to the Dáil, on a weekly and a monthly basis, because that is the only solution ultimately to the housing crisis. And you should be finding that sort of information out. Churchfields is another land bank. They're developing it very, very slowly. But the other one is they've put on their long-term strategy. That should be a priority and that's why we actually need a state construction company to cut through all of the red tape, to cut through all of the bureaucracy, to identify the public land, to put the workers that are available, to prioritise them to build in actual homes rather than offices and commercial buildings. And, that's how we'll get the teachers, the nurses, the therapists, the essential workers that we need to end so many of the problems that we're facing right now.
Inish an grúpa technical neoslach, Cúig Bomaja agus ag tosach le Chapter Collins.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. And first of all, I forgot to congratulate both ministers now on your appointment to your positions, and I wish you well going forward. And hopefully we can work close together. Sure, one of some of my own constituency in here, sure, but we should be able to work close together in here. I think this is the second or third time I spoke about housing today in the Dáil, and it's a huge crisis, a huge issue, and it doesn't matter if it's the young person looking for planning permission. That seems to be blocked at them. It doesn't matter if you're trying to your local village or town trying to grow. Trying to bring people into their community, they can't because of infrastructure being wrong, and this is one of the schemes that the government reopened this housing scheme under pressure, but is now failing to fund it properly. Homelessness is exploding with 15,000 people in emergency accommodation, yet the government paused a scheme that keeps families housed. The housing crisis is turning into housing chaos as more people are pushed out of their homes each year while the government drags its feet. The Tenant in Situ scheme was working effectively, saving over 2,500 households. So why shut it down? This is about priorities, and the government has got it all wrong. They can find villains for overspending, but claim no funds for housing solutions. Landlords want certainty, not red tape, as overcomplicated rules discourage them from engaging with the scheme. Approved housing bodies, which can manage social housing well, are being locked out of the scheme. The government is also failing rural tenants, with local councils in smaller towns needing the scheme, but being underfunded. We need a Minister for Housing who will act and not make excuses. The Minister must take responsibility and ensure adequate housing funding. The solution is simple: fund it, fix it and stop playing politics. The government needs to provide proper funding and allow local council to act. And the problem is, and that's why I've been talking all day here today, is it's not just this problem alone. There is so many issues here that haven't been tackled over the last number of years, and it's led to people, people have been very angry and frustrated. My last two phone calls, and I know that is coincidental, I'll accept that, were on planning permission for people, concerned about their planning, worried about planning, and getting negative vibes back from the planners. And I have said that today, that actually it's the rural planning guidelines need to be changed. The planners are only just going through what's before them. They can't give planning where, if the guidelines tells them they can't give planning. But it's completely just negative vibe in relation to housing and homes for people that are desperate to get a start in life, whether it is a new house or what. And you see, and I don't know, I hope Deputy Brown knows it, but Deputy O'Sullivan, you do know and understand the situation that's going on in Dunmanway, going on in Shannon Vale, going on in Ballydehob, Goleen and Roscarry. Some of them are waiting, is it 27 years to get their wastewater treatment plant done up in their area, so they can build. You were at a meeting with myself there recently through Zoom. You were there in Dunmanway in relation to the wastewater treatment plant there. They cannot build a house there, and there's no future. Like 2020, maybe 30 or 2035ish, or maybe 2040, we'll be at workshops every day of the week. Well, if I hear any that old palaver coming out of the mouth, the bottom line is, the money isn't there, or the money isn't going there. And that's the problem with Dunmanway, and that's the problem with Shannonfield, and that's the problem with Roscarry, and that's the problem with Goleen, and that's the problem with Ballydehob. And they're Ishgare are walking away scot-free. And I have called continuously for the last, I think, 5 business meetings, and I will again tomorrow morning in the business meeting, that we need time to discuss Ishgare and Irish Water, basically, and the problems that exist in relation to Irish Water, and the fact that there's no delivery of proper delivery services. And we have to, I think I have another minute, I have 4 minutes in total, we have to really look into this matter and see why isn't the funding being made available. Why can't we look at a developer to deliver the wastewater treatment plant, seeing as Ishgare can't deliver the wastewater treatment plant? And Minister, I'd love for you to get up and say, OK, you're dead right. We're not going to be able to do Dunmanway, Shannonfield, Ballydehob, Goleen and Roscarry in the next 12 months. But we can put a deadline as to when it's going to happen. So is it going to happen in 2030, 2040, 2050? Good God, these people deserve to know where they're going with their towns and villages. Well, raw sewage is pouring down into Shannonfield, into a local play park there. It's astonishing. It's astonishing that the EPA are closing a blind eye, Ishgare are closing a blind eye, and the people are left there with no home. So I can't go back to Dunmanway this weekend and tell them that maybe in 2032 or maybe in 2040 they're guaranteed that they will have a proper infrastructure put in their town so they can develop their town further.
Right, we're a minute then.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to congratulate Deputy O'Sullivan, or Minister O'Sullivan, on his position. Delighted to see his Cork man elevated. And I know we've been working very hard in your constituency. And don't worry, because I know Deputy Collins has taken on extra staff because I know you're not in the constituency anymore, and he'll be looking after all the necessary needs from Goleen all the way up. So there's no need to panic or worry. Minister, I know what a good worker you are. I have to say, the Tenant in Situ scheme, and I praise the Sinn Féin organisation for bringing this to the House, has been a great success. And what you're proposing, and the changes that you're proposing, from the victory and the success of Tenant in Situ, you're snatching from the jaws of victory defeat. It's working. It's working very well. Since last October, we've had no movement on Tenant in Situ in Cork City. 40 families. And why do people want to be in Tenant in Situ? Very simple. You have children based in the community, you have your sports clubs, you have all your necessaries around you, all your supports, and yet you're expected to vacate a house when a landlord is selling and off you go, abscond to somewhere else, or go into homeless services. The reality here is that I wanted to make you aware of one particular couple who lost their house in 2008. Through no fault of their own. They lost their house from the mismanagement of the Fianna Fáil administration at the time. Then what happened is that they're now renting accommodation. They were recently told that they'll have to vacate that property or will have to try and arrange the tenant in situ. Cork City Council can't engage because they don't know what's happening in the department. Nobody is making a decision. A cheque hasn't been signed since October. You're looking at a situation where civil servants don't particularly like this scheme and they're influencing the minister. It really is a case of Sir Humphrey inside in the department and a bumbling minister or ministers that are not capable of making a decision. Not capable of realising that something that works, that something that is good, one of the only things that is good coming out of the housing department, one of the only things that's coming good, we'll get rid of that too, lads. We might as well be a complete failure. Absolute complete failure seems to be the rhetoric of this government. And it's just simply not good enough. You're not listening to your own elected representatives. Have you heard the people on the back benches talking? If you listen to them, but I know you've been concentrating on your phone for most of the time, Minister. But when you listen to your own party, what they're saying, and what your backbenchers are saying, and what they're telling us in the corridors, we're all telling you the truth. We're all telling you the truth. We're telling you what's working, what's not working, and you're not listening, nor do you have any interest in either being in this House, listening to what's been said tonight, or to your own TDs. It's a disgrace. Joke.
Dr. Lawless.
Minister, and I do welcome the opportunity to speak on the motion, and I want to thank Sinn Féin for bringing this motion here this evening. The Tenant in Situ scheme was actually working quite well in Mayo up to recently, but over the past year it has been paused entirely. And I've had a number of constituents who have actually agreed terms, agreed a sale deal with Mayo County Council. And they agreed that over a year ago, Minister, and they're still waiting in the line. They're still waiting to effectively know what's happening without really any update or correspondence or very little communication. Meanwhile, the eviction notice that is now about to be served is about to happen, and the landlord is essentially saying, well, since we don't know what's happening, we have to now return to the private to the private sale. So, Minister, we need clarity and we need to move on this quickly. It's over a year now for many of my constituents who've agreed a deal, and yet there's no information from government. It's unacceptable. And this should have, this change of the scheme, it needs to happen, and we need to have clarity in relation to it very, very quickly. But the scheme is working, and I would ask you, Minister, to ensure it continues into the future. But I do believe, Minister, it does represent a broader point. And the broader point is that this government has lots of schemes. And they may sound well in media and interviews and so on, but the detail in terms of the schemes are incredibly lacking. So the Tenant in Situ scheme, paused now for over a year in Mayo. The affordable housing scheme has yet to deliver a house under this government or the last government over the last 5 to 10 years. No affordable housing scheme. We're promised 10. Those units have been promised for many, many years, and yet has not happened. The first home scheme, Minister, also not happening in the West in particular. The Help to Buy scheme as well, not happening in the West, largely due to the fact that it's new builds and there's so little new building happening in Mayo. Another scheme that is failing. And again, there's no service site scheme either. So, Minister, there are schemes and schemes that this government is responsible for. And yet, when you go and look at the detail, there is so little delivery in relation to that. One scheme that is working okay, the vacant property scheme, for example, there has been over 8,000 applications approved on that scheme, and yet only 1,100 applicants have been successful. That's just over 10% of applicants who have been approved on the scheme have actually been successful on that scheme. So, Minister, in the absence of any real scheme for the people of Mayo, will you consider reducing the cost of construction? Because I've spoken to many builders over the last number of months, and they've told me they're pricing jobs, and families, couples, young people, they can't afford to build. They're going to builders, they get planning permission, they have tender documents, and they just can't afford it. And over the last number of years, timber, for example, has increased 70% from 2021 to 2022. Concrete increased almost 50% in 2021 to 2024. Cement increased almost 60% during that time. And what has your government done to address this? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. VAT, you've taken in over €3 billion last year. Carbon tax, excise, customs, defective concrete, block levy, all of these things are actually preventing young people in Mayo and right across the country building their own home. Minister, in the absence of your schemes, because they're not working, will you please address the issue of cost and construction costs for young couples? Because the government's taking the lion's share, and you can do something, and you must do something to address this.
The Tenant in Situ acquisition scheme may have been a temporary measure initially, but it's one which has proved absolutely necessary in protecting some of the most vulnerable in our society. It was by no means perfect, but bureaucratic ineptitude at both national and local level led to it being a lot less than it could have been. I've had multiple examples of small landlords with long-standing tenants who are extremely concerned about what will happen to the individuals and families who are facing homelessness as a result of their property being sold And in many cases, Minister, these people had no option but to sell because of their own financial pressures. They saw the tenant in situ scheme as a win-win, but many owners who submitted the properties in good faith were hampered by concerns over funding or massive delays in the processing of applications. They had to give up. Now, government delays in funding and changes to the scheme have added to the huge uncertainty. In numerical terms, it has taken many potential housing units off the market, but in human terms, it has caused devastation to many families. Not only are so many families needlessly facing homelessness now, but in South Dublin, as of last month, and it was mentioned by other deputies in relation to their county council areas, in South Dublin as of last month, all the homeless hubs were full up. So once these tenants have to leave, where are they going to go? It's shocking and it's outrageous. So we're coming into the second quarter of this year and we still don't have proper guidelines in terms of how the revised scheme will work. We've a lot of platitudes, but no certainty. And with no certainty, you have less property owners willing to take a risk, especially with no clarity on timescales or on refurbishment works and the 2-year rule in the property where a family could have been renting for over a decade. The tenant in situ scheme, of course, is a relatively costly way to keep a roof over people's heads. We know that. But in the absence of any meaningful action on the macro level, it's a lifeline for so many families. The government's motion contains a lot of weasel phrases and passing the buck over to local authorities. We simply need more funding, more certainty and a time limit on the applications process, which can drag on and over 9 months in some cases, sometimes up to a year. So in essence, this government needs to do better. You've listened to this motion, you've listened to the contributions, and I hope that you will take note. Gurv Margaret Galer.
an Realtas agus an Ara.
Thank you, Cahirlock. And I thank the deputies for your contributions. Firstly, as my colleague Minister Sullivan has stated, it is a clear focus of this government to increase the supply of new built social and affordable homes. Increasing the overall housing supply is key to addressing the housing challenge and preventing and ultimately eliminating long-term homelessness. That being said, I would like to assert this government's commitment to the continuation of the second-hand social housing acquisitions programme, and in particular more focus and targeted tenant in situ acquisitions. It is important to note that the tenant in situ acquisitions are part of a wider acquisitions programme for social housing, including acquisitions for older persons and persons with a disability, exits from homeless services, and buy or renew acquisitions which tackle vacancy. I am acutely aware of the potential situation being faced by households in receipt of social housing supports under HAP and RAS, who receive a no-fault notice of termination. As a government, we understand the urgency and the need to ensure these tenants are prevented from entering homelessness. We will continue to work with local authorities to address these challenges and implement policies that will make a positive difference. This government recognises the importance of tenant in situ acquisitions as a key measure in preventing homelessness. We also recognise how these acquisitions positively benefit vulnerable tenants who receive a no-fault notice of termination from their landlord. Since the extension of the acquisitions programme, officials from my department have engaged with local authorities to ensure these updated measures are communicated clearly and promptly to local authority staff. These engagements are focused on ensuring the efficient continuation of targeted acquisitions by local authorities, and I want to be clear in reasserting the commitment of this government to the acquisitions programme and to point out how the actions carried out to date demonstrate that commitment very clearly. While there is still much to do, the Sinn Féin motion and opposition inputs here this evening do not fairly represent the efforts and progress made to date. The motion asserts that the acquisitions programme was suspended and is intentionally being restricted. But as Minister Sullivan highlighted at the outset, since 2020, almost 7,000 homes have been acquired and just over 3,100 homes have been acquired in 2023 and to Q3 2024. These numbers clearly highlight the success of the acquisitions programme as a key measure in preventing homelessness and makes clear that such acquisitions were not suspended at any time. I would also like to note that this government has provided funding for the continuation of the programme in 2025 to ensure momentum can be maintained. For 2025, the programme is supported by funding of €325 million, and the provision of a capital funding allocation to each local authority will promote best practice and will result in greater flexibility in the response to these local needs. This flexibility will enable local authorities to decide on the most appropriate action to prevent homelessness in each case. These measures further demonstrate this government's commitment to addressing and preventing homelessness through tenant in situ acquisitions. In addition to the funding provided, this government is aiming to further improve the operation of the programme, ensuring it is fair and accessible to those most in need. And the addition of eligibility criteria will provide greater focus and target the most vulnerable tenants, such as families, older persons, persons with disability and people exiting homelessness. The motion claims that the introduction of eligibility criteria will exclude certain cohorts, but I refute this claim and reiterate the introduction of these criteria will provide a more focused and targeted programme to benefit the most vulnerable in our society, which must be welcomed. That being said, it is important to note that these criteria do not exclude any tenant that is served with a notice to quit. It should also be noted that the first response of local authorities is to work with these tenants to assess all available options to prevent the threat of homelessness. The increased flexibility provided under arrangements for 2025 ensure local authorities are in a position to respond to local needs and to support not only priority category acquisitions, but also single persons and couples without children. The government is committed to providing a targeted, fair and equitable programme to ensure the availability of these benefits for those most in need. And I do think some of the mental gymnastics that has gone on from the opposition here today is actually quite extraordinary. Like Sinn Féin's own housing policy from only November 2024 proposes reducing the tenant in situ acquisitions programme down to 800 over the next few years. Nobody from Sinn Féin highlighted that there today, so they didn't, but there's a clear intention to reduce it. I don't understand the difficulty from Sinn Féin in terms of insisting that the landlords be registered with the RTB. Surely that is good policy. Or that the property be up to standard. These are properties that are being let out by landlords. What is Sinn Féin's difficulty with ensuring that these landlords keep these properties up to proper standards? What is Sinn Féin's problem with prioritising children, people with disabilities and older people? Because that's what you're objecting to in your motion, so it is. Labour went to even more extraordinary lengths to try and make a point. They want tax breaks for these landlords, even where these landlords might be operating outside of the Residential Tenancy Board. An extraordinary statement from Labour here today, so it is. It's a pity they didn't wait for the response, but anyway, we won't go there. Tabling this counter motion, I would like to reassert that the intended review of the second-hand acquisitions programme that will be carried out in 2025 will aim to build on the progress to date and further improve the programme by way of appropriate policy making. We will continue to work tirelessly to address these challenges and implement policies that will make a positive difference. In conclusion, I would like to reassert the government's commitment to a targeted programme and to highlight that this programme is already addressing the concerns raised. The progress made today provides evidence of the effectiveness of the second-hand acquisitions, and by implementing the improved arrangements for 2025, this government aims to build on this success. Government is clear in its commitment to the core principle that everybody should have access to a home. We accept that there is more to do, but as my colleague Minister Sullivan has already said, the government is fully dedicated to addressing the housing crisis through the necessary measures, which include the continuation of the tenant in situ acquisitions. It remains a priority for this government to prevent homelessness and to help those in emergency accommodation to exit as soon as possible. We will continue to work with the local government sector to maintain progress, and I look forward to working with everyone in this chamber to ensure continued success. Thank you, Gerlach.
Mágat inis Sinn Féin agus Teachta Maitin Gá Bómaide.
Minister, I wish you both of you well in your new roles. I would like to thank my colleagues in Sinn Féin for bringing this relevant and important tenant in situ PNB to the floor of the House this evening. The tenant in situ scheme is a vital tool in the prevention of homelessness and has been a saviour to many families across the country. Since April 2023, the tenant in situ scheme alone has saved over 2,500 households from the sickening prospect of losing a roof over their heads or being at the mercy of a system that is overwhelmed and broken due to dealing with the sheer volumes of evictions and notices of termination. In my own county of Wexford, 52 households have been benefited from this scheme since 2023, 13 in the Wexford District, 14 in the Scorty District, 12 in the Gorey District, 12 in the New Ross District and 1 in the Rosslare District. Without this scheme, those families and individuals would have ended up in hostels and in overcrowded emergency accommodation centres or granny's boxroom flat or room, as if they're lucky. Minister, I would like to ask that the new proposed criteria by the Department of Housing be fully re-evaluated and return to the current rules. Under new proposals, a couple without children will be excluded. Single citizens will be excluded. A property must be at least 2 years in the social housing support scheme, and the Housing Department also is removing the ability of councils to exceed the set targets. Plus, the councils will not be able to reclaim refurbishment costs. Surely these measures, to put it mildly, are downright unfair, discriminatory and restrictive in nature, disavowing a large cohort of single people and couples from a scheme that could prevent them from becoming homeless. Figures show that the highest cohort of people seeking social housing in fact is single people. To reduce any funding to local authorities and introduce restrictive access measures to the Tenant in Situ scheme in a time of housing emergency is bad policy and will result in more people becoming homeless. The Department must roll back and remove their new discriminatory restrictive proposals and increase the necessary staff to process applications in an efficient and timely manner. Again, Minister, we see rents averaging €1,423 in my own county and an increase in rents of 5.7% nationally, year on year in. So, Minister, I'd just like to ask deputies to note the fault lines in the Department, new proposals and support this bill. Thank you.
The most recent homeless figures issued in January show a significant rise in the number of people and families who are homeless. Homeless figures have reached record levels and stand at an overall total of 15,286, of which 4,603 are children. Over the last number of years, a large number of landlords have been leaving the rental sector. Estimates show that between 2021 and 2023, roughly 40% of landlords have left the market. The Tenant in Situ scheme has operated successfully for 2,500 households since April 23, which represents thousands of men, women and children who would otherwise have been made homeless. This is a plus for both the families who would otherwise be homeless and also for the landlords. However, a large degree of uncertainty has been created and is causing unnecessary delays because of the lack of clarity on funding and the new rules being introduced, which will be more restrictive and make it more difficult for people to avail of the scheme. As a consequence, we have a large number of families living in fear of being evicted and of being made homeless, and many are forced to overstay in the rental property because the local authorities have not received the approvals to go ahead with the scheme. In my constituency of Dublin North West, I have at present a number of such cases agreed and being held up because Dublin City Council is waiting for the go-ahead from your department. In this housing and homeless crisis, this is just not acceptable. Families are under severe strain and stress, not knowing where they stand and with the threat of homelessness hanging over their heads. Minister, you need to act immediately to get this scheme up and running. Your department needs to actively engage with local authorities and implement this scheme as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
Minister, despite government assertions that you are tackling the housing crisis and adequately fighting to end homelessness, the reality on the ground tells a far different story. In 1 week in January 2024, there were 172 adults accessing emergency accommodation in Louth. The same week in 2025, that had jumped to 232 adults. That is a stark 35% increase in those needing emergency accommodation in the space of just a year. By any definition or metric, that paints a picture of abject failure to tackle homelessness in Louth by this government. As a former county councillor and chair of Louth County Council's Housing Strategic Policy Committee, I know the impact and real-life positives the Tenant in Situ scheme had for those lucky enough to be approved. And still, the requests by tenants who have been served notice to quit by their landlords who want to sell their properties are coming in thick and fast, daily and weekly. But for some reason, this scheme that has actually delivered and allowed people to stay in their homes has been suspended since the end of last year due to the failure of government to agree the funding and targets for 2025, with hundreds of applications left pending without a decision due to uncertainty and lack of funding. That delay has put people out of the homes that in some cases they rented for years or even decades, and in turn causing homelessness. This decision by government will cost the taxpayer more in the long run, as those that will have to leave their homes will most likely end up in emergency accommodation. You must provide local authorities with their capital allocations and targets for 2025 as a matter of urgency. Allow them to process all outstanding applications and reopen the Tenant in Situ scheme without restrictions to new applications. This is your first big policy decision, Minister, and I'd urge you not to oppose this motion or back the government amendment, as the proof in what government policy delivers is clear. That's a 35% increase in those needing emergency accommodation in my constituency in just 1 year. No one can stand over that.
The Tenant in Situ scheme has saved many a family across North Kildare from homelessness due to the housing crisis created by this government and the almost identical government before it. Abandoning this scheme is going to leave people in a housing limbo, suddenly facing homelessness. The Tenant in Situ scheme has offered a lifeline to those facing emergency accommodation, sofa surfing, sleeping in their cars or worse, sleeping rough. It is a vital homelessness prevention scheme. Yet it has been up to Sinn Féin and others to pressurise this government time and time again into keeping the scheme and making sure it works. Indeed, it was the opposition that pressured you into setting it up in the first place. County Kildare is currently 6th in the state across Dublin, outside of Dublin for adults accessing emergency accommodation, with an 11% increase from last year. It will be more than an 11% increase next year if we get rid of this scheme. It's hard to believe that this government is serious about housing when we see homelessness figures continuously rise, the untruths told about housing targets during the last general election, and our own Taoiseach laughing it up about the housing crisis in Ireland with the property tycoon in the Oval Office in the White House. But we shouldn't be surprised. This is the company that Fianna Fáil keep. It is the party of the Galway tent and developers and speculators. While your buddies are all profiting off a crisis that you have created, an entire generation is starting to emigrate. I've seen it now in my friends, in my daughter's friends. They're starting to emigrate, and those who can't afford it are being locked out of housing. It's an Irish shiv.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, the concern, and it is a genuine concern that has motivated us bringing forward this private member's motion, is that the capital funding that has been announced by your department to date and the new restrictive eligibility criteria will result in fewer tenant in situ purchases this year than last year, even if the demand is the same. That's the central concern here. The total capital allocation of 325 million, as you said, is across 4 acquisition streams. That funding at current average acquisition prices will deliver fewer homes this year than last year or the year before. That's simply a fact. The restrictive criteria you're introducing make no sense. Reasonable refurbishment costs are a vital element for this scheme to work, and without it, many properties will go unbought. Prioritising one group of vulnerable homeless people inevitably means deprioritising and ultimately excluding another group of very vulnerable homeless people. They are both equally as deserving of prioritisation. Currently, they receive that, and that should not change. The 2-year rule makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and there seems to be a suggestion that somehow somebody somewhere is gaming the system. I'm not saying you're saying that, but some of the people advising you, I think, may believe that, despite the fact that there's no evidence. And the very, very rigid adherence on a notice to quit, rather than the slightly more flexible approach that has been in evidence over the last period, really, I have to say, is regrettable. You say the scheme is not suspended. Minister, on the ground, that is not the truth. If I ring a local authority today, as a landlord, I will be told no new applications have been taken until the Minister has made his decision and the circular is issued. There are hundreds of applications that were made last year that are awaiting a final decision that cannot be processed. Now, I don't know what definition of the word suspended you operate on, but for me, that is a suspension. All I'm asking you to do is, if you're not willing to listen to us, go and talk to the people on the front line. Go and talk to the people preventing homelessness in the statutory and voluntary sector and ask them, do they think this will make the scheme better or worse? They will tell you it will make it worse. I'm urging you to reconsider. Please, between now and when you sign off on the circular, do not make these changes. Do not make more people homeless who otherwise would not be so. Do the right thing and scrap these proposed changes. Thank you, Chair.